Welcome back, everyone. I'm not going to do elaborate introductions. We've had all that at the beginning from Michael, but just briefly, of course, for those of you who have joined us, Jill Volpe on the end needs no new introduction. David Poutney from Welsh National Opera. Ash, I can't remember. Carr, yes, forgive me, from Opera Now, and Ivan Rocky, who works with British Youth Opera. So we thought the second segment should say we'd talk a little bit more about what the future might look like. So I think we're going to start, based on our sort of huddle in the last 20 minutes, is on a bit of insight into what new opera, new works, and new things could be done. So I guess what I'd like to, the first question I'd like to pose is, what could we do? What could the community do, besides getting Vivian Duffield to put £5 million up, to get new opera, some exciting new things happening in new works and innovations in opera? And shall we just do this chronologically? How about Ivan? Why don't you start, since you're...
Thanks. Since I'm here representing youth, I think, I will just say the first thing about youth. For people who don't know British youth opera, youth, as far as we're concerned, starts at about 21 and runs into your mid-30s. Singers, of course, have a different definition of youth than most people. So we're working with postgraduate singers and singers who are just out of college, and most of them want to do grand opera, but find themselves working at that kind of age for much smaller opera companies who, on the whole, are not doing grand opera. So actually they have the chance to work with newer repertoire. We tend to do at least one opera a year that is 20th or very occasionally 21st century. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to commission one for ourselves yet. What we find with the singers is that for most of them, it's actually quite a new thing for them, even at that stage. So I think that's sort of from where I come from on this with young singers and the future of opera and what kind of exciting things could come out of it, is that actually we need to be able to provide singers with the sort of techniques and talents and skills to be able to work on newer operas. Some of them are now doing that at music colleges. And I mean, I have to mention, because David may not, Camilla Tonin, that was done at the Royal Academy, for which David wrote the libretto and directed. Speaking to the singers who worked on that, most of them found it to be a just completely new experience for them. It is still, however, in most senses, an opera rather than music theatre. And I think that's one of the interesting things for us to explore now, is actually that difference between opera and music theatre. Because looking at some of the larger companies, obviously the Met, your examples of the 4 works that you commissioned are, in a sense, grand opera. We were talking just now about the Royal Opera House, Anna Nicole, and more recently the Judith Weir piece that's been on very recently, Misfortune. Across the road at ENO, on the other hand, they've just been working with Punch Drunk, now a year or 2 ago, on the Duchess of Malfi, which they did out in a warehouse in East London with the audience walking around. And that, I think, for many people who are not already engaged in opera, in the opera world, that, I think, represents a slightly more interesting direction for opera to be taking, that actually sort of stretching the definition of opera. I mean, they sold that out every night, admittedly a much smaller audience, I think, than they would have had at ENO, because they couldn't fit so many people in, and partly because it's this sort of promenade performance.
So if I were to summarize, you're talking that new opera or innovation in opera has to do with different kinds of presentation, different sorts of environments, different kinds of locations in terms of where you might attract an audience. What about the art form itself? What is going to be different? Anything?
In a sense, I think that is the art form. The art form is, only exists when it's actually being presented to people. And so actually the composers, if they need to consider the way in which their opera is going to be presented. We've talked quite a bit out having coffee about the difference between large-scale organisations and small-scale organisations. And so again, coming back to the fact that particularly young singers will be working for smaller organisations a lot, they have the opportunity to work with new operas that interact with their audiences in a very different way. So I'm not sure I would be able to separate out, actually, the art form and the way it develops from the way that the presentation of opera develops.
Bill, might I suggest, you're the moderator, but I can't help myself, I'm sorry.
It's all right. You're the general director.
Might I suggest that if Ivan says something and it mentions David, let's not be so formal that we go down the line and then we go back. Let's have a conversation about it, so that if Ash wants to respond, or if I want to respond, or David, just respond. I mean, I think it's, rather than keep, I'd like to see if we can open it up, that we're having a discussion rather than this formal affair, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Well, can I say, I mean, I am next in line, but can I just say that this, the idea of how do we make new opera, I mean, I don't think you can make opera happen. I don't think you can force people to do opera. Opera kind of happens, and I think you have to be there to put in the support and the enthusiasm, and okay, Vivian Duffield puts in her money. We've had things like the Genesis Foundation, which has supported new opera, but you know, sometimes you get this opera by committee happening, where you have sort of lots of people ticking boxes saying, yes, this is what opera has to be. I think we're very lucky in this country in that we have an amazing sort of entrepreneurial spirit in opera. We have lots of young people from the opera group, and I'm on the board of a little company called Second Movement. There's sort of heritage opera. There's all sorts of little opera companies all up and down the country doing all sorts of work. And this is sort of an ecology of opera, because opera kind of has to happen. It's part of a cultural landscape. I don't think you have to kind of make it happen by saying, you know, we've got to make new work be. I do think we have to, I think one thing that is interesting is this idea that of opera coming from the voice, which is extremely important. I don't think there's enough connoisseurship of the voice. I don't think we know what voices can do. I don't think the public really knows how to talk about voices properly in the way that we can talk about wine or travel or weather or whatever it is. I think we need a language of voice so that we can actually just talk about it properly. And I also think composers need to know what to do with voices, because a number of times I've sat in an opera house listening to new work where the composer has made lovely noises in the orchestra, they've sort of told a story reasonably well, but they just haven't a clue how to use a human voice to its full potential. And I think that that relationship between composers and singers needs to be much better developed.
Ash, I want to disagree with your first statement, which was you said you can't make new opera happen. You absolutely can.
Well, you can't force people to do opera.
No, but you can make it happen, and I do. In the last 4 years at the Breakdance Festival, I will have presented 4 world premieres of operas deliberately, in this instance, designed to be composed for a normal audience, sitting in a normal theatre, because that's what we are. That is absolutely in no way to suggest that you can't explore every conceivable way of telling a story through music. That is all opera is. I absolutely am not interested in these struggles to define the difference between music, theatre, and opera. You know, opera is just simply the gesture of telling a story through music. And that's why, in fact, it'll always survive, even if the Met goes down and Covent Garden goes down, and, you know, all these big institutions end, the instinct to tell a story with music will survive, and that will recreate some kind of opera, maybe even going back to the way it started, you know, with people sitting around in a room making a Monteverdi piece in intimate surroundings. So that's not my concern. And in fact, the amazing thing is, I mean, you talked about having done 4 new commissions at the Met, which is, for the Met, probably a pretty good record. But there is an immense amount of new writing going on. I'm looking to create a new piece for the WNO for their 70th birthday. And the interesting thing is, when you inquire around the composers in Europe, they're all desperately busy, and they're all producing new operas between now and our 70th birthday. So, you know, you realize there's a vast, insane amount of activity out there, most of which, of course, is going to fail, and always has failed. If you look at all the operas that were premiered in the year that Lohengrin was premiered in, you know, you'll read the name Lohengrin and you'll read 75 names that you've never heard of from composers who are totally forgotten. So the rate of failure is lethal, but that's inevitable. It has to be like that.
That is one of the problems with writing new opera now, is that you're writing against a canon that's grown and grown and grown.
Why is that a problem?
That's not a problem. It just means that there is already an existing sort of body of work that you're in a way contending with. It's difficult in a way to be new.
Well, that's tough. I mean,
No, it's tough, exactly.
all of culture is relating back to its past, and you can't say I'm not going to write a play because Shakespeare wrote 26 rather good ones.
I mean, how much risk? I mean, this is one thing that I dealt with quite recently in an editorial that I wrote, which was, how much risk can you take as an opera company when you're struggling with money, when you're struggling with public?
Well, but I think that's what's happening in the States, and in my discussion with Mark Skorka, Opera America, it's the smaller companies that are doing, the ones that are very light and nimble, they're doing all the creation. They might only have an audience of 200 people. But those 200 people are supporting the company. But those are the ones that can be very creative and not commission, but in fact write new opera. Yes, it's very difficult for the grand old companies to do it, only because we're locked into a financial system that works against it, particularly in the States, relying on the box office's revenues and patrons. Maybe here it's a little different as you get this glorious funding from your government. Which, by the way, is that waning at all?
Yeah. You bet.
But it seems to me that it's there, it's flourishing, but it's in the smaller companies, and the big companies kind of stumble along. Now, if you and your company can afford to do it, it's wonderful. I mean, yes, it would have been great at the Met, instead of doing 4, doing 20. But guess what? I couldn't afford to do that. We closed the doors. But it is happening.
And I mean, surely any artistic institution or cultural institution which is not taking risk doesn't deserve to exist.
I agree, yeah. But I guess it has to be accountable risk. I mean, you can put, I mean, when do you step in to a process of a new opera and say, actually, this isn't working, let's not spend the money on it?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, half the time it's like the chap had a question about why doesn't the general director stop this production?
Right.
Well, a commission is a train, and it sets off on its journey. And of course, you can read the libretto and you can say, no, I don't think this libretto is good enough. Let's go back and try again. But there always comes the point when the composer is halfway through, and it's an unstoppable train. And you've got commitments, you've got singers, you've got all those things. So the idea that you can manipulate these things or endlessly workshop them and produce a success, I think is
But I want to go back to the question of risk, because you said if they don't take risk, they shouldn't be in business. Now, that's a very grand statement, I think, because yes.
And I stand by it.
And you stand by it. But so the point is, am I then going to look at the WNO and there'll be no standard repertoire? Because that's not risky. It's all new.
No, of course not.
So it's measured risk. And I mean, I think that's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And no, but it's again, I mean, David did, to me, with Philip Glass, one of the most wonderful productions at the Met, The Voyage. And I was just talking about it earlier. I just adore it. I think it's wonderful, and yet it doesn't have legs. And I think my next charge is to get that thing produced again somewhere, really, because I think it's wonderful. Now, and so the risk for the Met is, I don't know how much it cost, the production, whatever. I mean, whether it was funded or not, that's all water over the dam. But I think we also have to prepare the public, the audience, so they can accept these things. I mean, and that's where there's work also.
But there's an
reduce the risk.
There's an interesting question there, because if we're talking about innovation in opera, and one innovation is, of course, new works, new ways of presenting it, new styles of singing, maybe, whatever, acting. But what about innovation in the existing repertory? There are 30 operas that the Met does every year, and all the other major companies do all the time, the top 30, and then there's probably the next 30, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that you hear once in a lifetime. I mean, what kind of innovation are we doing? Now, in Joe's presentation on Thursday night, we had a canter through some of Joe's favorite productions. And then we had a little coda at the end, which was, I would guess, all of your least favorite productions, which were innovative, mostly European productions.
Wait a minute, I did not say that. What I said was, here is a history of production in the Met. where as early on when it was founded in the late 1800s, 1900, and this is how productions have developed. I then had 5 examples of production that were done in Europe. The last example was the Bronze Horse. Are you familiar with that? The one that was produced in Europe now? Okay. There was a Don Giovanni, which there was a photo, and it looked to me like, I didn't even see people. In other words, I saw a flower garden, and maybe there was a face in there. There was a Queen of Spades with rabbit ears, and I'm trying to figure out where in Queen of Spades do you see pink rabbit ears?
One of yours.
No, it wasn't one of yours. So no, I believe one can be innovative, but I do believe one has to follow a certain line, and and that's what I asked David earlier.
But I don't have to follow your line.
You don't have to follow my line.
I have to follow my line.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But the question is, so we were talking about, do you change the libretto or do you ignore it? That's what you said, you ignore it. I say you change it. Because I hate it, particularly with titles. I'm going to look at titles, a simple example, I'm going to go into I smell the orange blossoms and I'm in the sewer. But that doesn't work for me. So I just ignore the titles because everybody wants titles today. What do you do with that?
I suppose, the thing is that opera isn't a literal art form. People don't sing to each other in real life. So actually imagery and this sort of, in a way, dreamscape, I think is quite important, because I think the audience does have to shift into another gear in order to sit through opera. And I don't think that opera is like film, and it's not like reading a book. It's a thing in its own right. And the way that music affects you as you sit and watch and a narrative unfolds is like nothing else, which is what makes opera very, very special.
Let me give you I agree with you. And my problem is, I think, you see, if we present naturalistic images, you're actually limiting the audience's ability to imagine the music. And just take a very simple example. As in many Wagner operas, the scenery is, the setting described in the score takes place on a mountainside. Well, there is no such mountainside that can ever be put on any stage, not even on the stage in Bregenz can put a mountainside on the stage. So the mountainside that you put on that stage is immediately a huge interpretive step. It can never be a mountainside. And actually, it's one of the oddest things to do in reaction to a mountainside, to put a flat painting of a mountainside on the stage. Because what on earth has a one-dimensional image got to do with a mountainside? So what, if you'll excuse me, conservative people tend to think that they want on a stage, which is a picture of a mountainside, is in fact a bizarre interpretive perversion of a mountainside.
However, let's take Wagner, and let's take Wieland Wagner's Lohengrin. And I believe I had a photo of it. I'm sorry I don't now. And did you see his Lohengrin?
Yes.
Where you have the swan, which is gigantic, in other words, and quite frankly, that is not I think that's an incredible production, and you might say I'm conservative, but that's conservative in my. What it is, it's telling the story, but it's interpreting in a very stylized way. And I believe it can be stylized. I don't think you need a flat mountain, or I don't think you need a swan coming across the stage with feathers in its wings. Wieland Wagner's swan took over the whole stage, and I agree with that.
Surely there's just a question here about, and you're demonstrating perfectly that we all have different tastes in what we want to see. And the gentleman, if he's still here, who mentioned the opera house Rusalka recently. One of the things that fascinated me was the fact that it got very divergent reviews. And the opera house used that. If you look to the opera house's website that week, they had on their front page a quote from a 5-star review and a quote from a 1-star review of the same production, inviting the audience to come and decide. And so surely some of the productions, the small c conservative productions, are going to be liked by some people, and I would say the Met is probably exactly the kind of place that has the kind of audience that will like those productions. WNO may have a different audience, and they may be able to take slightly more risks.
Well, one issue that I wanted to pick up with you about what you said
Joe.
earlier is, I know you're right. Is when you said the audience.
Right.
And, I think one point is that in any town, like it's definitely in New York or San Francisco or London, there's always more than one audience.
Audiences, absolutely right.
And you can, it can't be done like that, but I think that's something that we did a bit of in London in the 80s, where, we actually steered a company in a consistent direction for 10 years, and to some extent changed the audience.
I totally agree.
And, you will lose some people, and hopefully you'll gain others. And
I do think there's a problem sometimes with co-productions. The Rusalka was a co-production with Salzburg. And there is an audience in Salzburg that has a relationship with directors there who put things on stage, and a sort of a Germanic relationship, which is that they're kind of expecting to be abused by what they see on the stage, when they actually want to be. They actually want, at some level, to be upset, because that stimulates them, because it is stimulating to be challenged in that way. And I'm not sure that, I think that London audiences have a kind of a different view of how they see drama and how they see stories being told. I think sometimes if you impose one on another, it just doesn't work. And I remember when Calixto Bieto was doing all his work at English National Opera in the, whatever it was, 10 years ago. And people were very upset by what they saw, and it kind of brought down the whole regime of English National Opera in a way at the time, because there were men sitting on lavatories, there were there was lots of sex and violence, and in a way I think it was not so much that it wasn't the sex and violence, because we're used to seeing that all the time, but I think it was because it was a very particular sensibility. It was sort of a Catalan sensibility of demonstrating something to a very particular audience that was then sort of parachuted into London. And I think that that's why those productions didn't work. I don't think it was the content per se. It was how that content was presented. I think that can be a problem.
But people do change, though, don't they? An awful lot. I mean, I did Rusalka in the 1980s, and the initial press reaction to that production was vitriolic. They all said, "Where's the lovely Czech countryside?" It was all set in a nursery and had a pond under the floor of the nursery and all of this. And there were lots of people saying there was no nature, there was no poetry, there's no traditional fairy tale accoutrements. 20 years later, people say, "Oh, that classic Rusalka production." It's already become such an old fart of a thing that it's a classic.
Either that or they have a bad memory. But no, it's so interesting. When Robert Wilson, I asked him to do Lohengrin at the Met, and they hated it. The public hated it. He was booed. The critics didn't like it. It came back. You know what? They got it. But it took a span of time for them to understand what Wilson was saying with that production. And I think it was a brilliant production. I don't know if you had
what was he saying?
What he was saying?
Yes.
The same he said 20 times before.
He was following, right, he was following the composer's wishes or intention, but in a very stylized way. So, yes, you didn't have the pictures. There was no tree. There was a light bar, and that light bar was the tree. But if you don't understand it, it takes the audience a little while to understand what the production is.
But if we call this...
But I don't listen to critics, Ivan, because you mentioned one critic was 5 and one is 10.
Exactly.
Do me a
That's
favor.
why not to
Don't mention critics again, because I don't like any of them.
My point, can I say, my point on that was really the way that the Opera House used those,
I understand,
not
okay.
the critics themselves.
But an important question, if innovation is important, when is innovation too much or too far or too fast, perhaps? I remember some years ago I was doing some work with the Salzburg Festival, and I asked the box office manager for tickets for their production of Die Entführung, and he looked at me and he said, "You can have all the tickets you want. It's the first time in my 35 years here haven't even sold half the house." It was a huge flop. I don't remember who the director was now, but obviously it went down badly with the audience. Now, was it a good or bad production? I didn't much like it, I have to admit. But I mean, when is too far? Is it shock factor? Is it ignoring the music? When I was speaking to a couple of my cronies and organizing today, one point that she asked me to bring up was stage directors go too far. And Joe, and quoting Joe from Thursday night, it's all about music and singing. So what do we do?
Something does go too far when it becomes all about the director and their preoccupation, and nothing else comes into it. And I think as long as there is a sort of anybody has to be able to explain why they're doing something. And I think if somebody has a sort of a coherent and an imaginative explanation as to why they're doing something, that's fine. I think that's why, in a way, critical response is important. I mean, we all, I write critiques of opera. I don't think that, I just say what I think. And I'm not expecting anybody else to agree with me, and I don't think that's a sort of an absolute statement. But on the other hand, I am sort of trying to find a rationale as to, why something was put on stage in the way that it was. And I think that sort of question is extremely important for everybody to ask. And when they read a critic of an opera, somebody writing about an opera, I hope that they're the questions that sort of arise in their minds. And it's not sort of, oh, well, this is what I should think because I've read it. It's, I believe that, this is interesting, let me see what I think about something.
I have a question for David, because there was production at the Met, Luc Bondy did Tosca. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
And I think also it's a question of taste. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, you can do a way out production, but there are certain things in the opera I think have to be tasteful. And I think this production went over the line. What's your, not on this production, but what's your feeling about taste in opera? I mean, just as far as what you see on the stage.
Well, I think you have to look at the development of taste, say, over a period of 100 years. If we take Carmen, for example, Carmen to the audience of Bizet's time was an incredibly shocking event because it was taking the language of opera and putting low-life characters on the stage, and nobody had done that before. Nobody had taken opera into the criminal area. Now, in the meantime, Carmen has become a picturesque postcard from some touristic Spain. And you have to work very hard, and somebody like Calixto Bieto would do that, in representing Carmen, to get back to the truth that Bizet encapsulated, which was, taking low-life criminal world into the world of opera. And, if I could try to summarize perhaps the relationship, it's very tricky to do, between music and the image or the directing or the production. Music remains to our ears more or less permanently understandable. That's to say, if we were to be people in 1830, we wouldn't hear Bizet's Carmen very differently from the way we hear it now. But if you look at an image from the time, say the front of a magazine or a newspaper or an advertising image, those images have changed wildly. And there's no way that the way we dress or the way we build houses or any of those visual things is anything like the same as the way the music sounds. So it's not surprising that productions become very different, because we're dealing with visual language which changes like this every 10 years, whereas music, we can all listen to a piece of William Byrd and we agree, we understand the same thing. The music is 300 years old. But if we looked at an image from that period, we would see it as being an ancient image, not relevant to us anymore.
Well, however, but let me ask this question. So, and I don't remember the production in Europe where all the chorus ladies were pregnant and then the principal gave birth on stage. What was the production?
Was it the Carmelites? No.
I'm not sure. No, it wasn't Carmelite. However, given today, I wouldn't be surprised if it was. But no, so what I'm saying, it's a question. I'm not questioning the image. It's completely different. I'm questioning the taste, because if you go to the movies today, it's all blood, guts. I watch what people are just on a plane watching some movies, and everybody's dying and bleeding, and they're beheaded, and maybe they did that, but we didn't do it in opera. The question is, in Tosca, should we have, is it appropriate, forget the scenery, that the protagonists are having sex on stage with prostitutes, bring prostitutes in, and have oral sex? What does that add to the opera?
Well, you mean it's just like Obama's security stuff?
Just like it. Just like. However, we didn't sell that to the public.
No, but Tosca is about a brutal regime. It's about attempted rape. It's about murder. It's it's not a tasteful story. So how do you make an audience that is sort of, who wants to kind of counter opera and in a way switch off and have a nice tasteful time? How do you say, well, actually, this is a story that's about more than good taste. It's a story that tells you something about brutality. And how do you make people go away with...
Well, but how do you show brutality, not taking it to the lowest level of life?
I don't think you need to be literal. And I think that's, that's going back to this thing of, okay, let's not have literal images, because opera can say something very profound about the way human beings behave without having literal things. And in a way, the end of what you're saying, Joe, about how opera should be presented is that if you think that actually every picture should tell you exactly what's going on stage, then Tosca would not be tasteful.
No, but I didn't say that.
Yeah.
You're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that.
I'm
I'm
asking you
asking
if
the
you did,
question about taste, because all I know from the U.S., and maybe we're all Puritans in the U.S., I mean, it could very well be, you know, it's never changed.
It's a part of your history.
Yeah, it's part of our history. However, what I'm saying is that I think one has to do things in a tasteful way, and you won't attract, I don't believe we're going to attract young audience members just because we don't keep things in a tasteful manner. I just don't think you're going to do that.
No, but I really want to question what taste has got to do with it. To me, you introduce the language of the drawing room, and I don't want theatre or opera or these things to be taking place in a drawing room. I think a theatre is a place of confrontation of ideas, and sometimes this confrontation should be bloody and violent and offensive, because those are subjects that are dealt with. You know, I just directed Prince Igor. In Prince Igor, it describes in the libretto, in Borodin's libretto, how this guy, this prince, has captured and raped underage girls. It's in that piece. Exactly as Beria, the security chief of Stalin, was famous for abducting schoolgirls. So if you put that into a production of Tosca, there will be an absolute historical precedent for saying that's the kind of thing that violent, bloody police chiefs did, and I think that could well belong in a appropriate production of Tosca. I'm leaving out this word tasteful because it bothers me.
Can I just want to go back to the different audiences, because I think this is really important in this context. And I'm going to go back to the ENO collaboration with Punch Drunk on the Duchess of Malfi, because that was in many respects quite tasteless as an opera would go. It ended with the soprano being strung up by her feet and raised up into the roof. I don't know whether anyone else saw it. And again, in very many ways, quite tasteless. This collaboration, you could see when walking, the audience all wore masks, but you could tell from walking around, not just from how people were dressed, who were the ENO audience who had come, and who were the punch-drunk audience who had come. The ENO audience were shocked. The punch-drunk audience took it entirely in their stride, because the kind of theatrical experience they were used to had entirely different taste boundaries. Using your word taste and your thing about different audiences, and the fact that in London we have these different audiences.
Well, I think in a way opera should be worried if there are such different audiences, and if you're not getting the sort of punch-drunk audience coming to the opera, I think you have to ask why.
And I think some of it is the venue, actually, and the fact that taking opera out of the grand opera houses kind of gives it license to step over different lines.
This comes back to an important point that I think you made several times on Thursday night, Joe, and that was the importance of the opera company's relationship with its audience, and how it nurtures that relationships for revenue, for contributions, for all that sort of thing. But what I'm hearing here is you're nurturing all kinds of different audiences in a way that a little company with a small budget might be able to risk a few bob, where the Metropolitan with a few million might have a pause before it makes too big a risk. But how do we move the art form forward? Again, innovation in direction, innovation in audience arrangements, innovation in whatever it takes to get people into the theatre. And I want to come to media in a few minutes. But I think this is interesting, because I've observed in my own theatre-going life is that certain things, certain events are things everybody wants to go to. In my years in San Francisco Opera, we had what was often described by everybody as a Eurotrash production of Elektra. It was by far the most interesting thing we did in all the years I was there, and you couldn't get a ticket for love nor money. But all it was a gigantic side of beef hanging from the middle of the stage, and a few German ladies singing around it. And riveting. It totally worked.
Well, I think with things like that, it's often, in a way, the more way out a production is, and the more you're trying to do something different on stage, the more absolutely solid the musical values have to be. And I've often been to a production where, it's been staged in a lavatory or in outer space or whatever it is, where the musical values just haven't been, either the singers haven't wanted to do it, so they haven't got very good singers, or they've got a B conductor in there because it's not an important production or whatever it is. And you cannot make theatre convincing unless the musical values are absolutely rock solid. And I think that's That's just an important thing, that the more way out you're going to be, the more your ensemble, I think that's where ENA was wonderful during David's time there in the 80s and 90s, was that there was an extraordinary ensemble that just took on board the most extraordinary ideas and presented them with the most extraordinary musical commitment, and I think that's what made them work.
Well, the point is that the music is, it is the most important thing, and the music is a fantastic conduit of communication with the audience, because, as I've said before, everybody can understand what's going on with the music. It doesn't challenge them. So, I agree with you. If you get the musical quality right, and you are committed to that quality, you can take all sorts of other crazy ideas, or even tasteless ideas, or dangerous ideas, or violent ideas, and they can ride in on the back of a convincing musical performance, and that will help the audience to engage with those things. And even if the audience hates them, don't forget, being confronted with dislike and hate is also an important part of any artistic experience. That's where the art should lead us to, is to confronting things, ideas that are surprising, offensive, dangerous, unsettling. That's our job, actually.
As long as you can stay in business.
Yes.
Because in San Francisco, isn't that what Pamela tried, Pamela Rosenberg? She tried that. But she lost her audience, lost her donors, and in fact, the company was in dire straits. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have some of that, but I think you have a responsibility also to keep your company afloat. And one needs to always keep that as the bottom line, because it doesn't do any good if you can't afford to stay in business.
But isn't this the danger of your American system, Joe, that you're talking about a city like San Francisco? Now, we all know San Francisco is full of crazy people. It's full of ex-hippies who've all got married now. It's full of people who've spent the first 25 years of their life on drugs. It's a very rich community, but the funding situation whereby you have to raise all this money and have these donors has created a specific audience at the San Francisco Opera, which is not flexible to engage with European stuff. And that's a problem of the funding.
Yeah. Now, the question then is, what's happening with funding in Europe and the UK? Has it remained rock solid at a certain level?
No.
Will this crisis of the euro and what's going on in Europe cause a situation where they will lose that funding, and then they're going to be in the same situation as the American opera houses?
That's right.
And then that's the risk.
It is the risk.
But let me talk about San Francisco, because I left San Francisco in '97. Lotfi Mansouri was the general director. He'd been there a long time. He was a very traditional, rather conservative person, but he understood his audience absolutely perfectly. He knew what they wanted. They had their favorite singers. He would cast a certain group of people opening nights. It was all very carefully organized around being sure that every ticket sold and that every donor renewed every year. Lotfi retired about 2 years after I left, 1999, I think it might have been, 2000, can't remember exactly. Anyway, Pamela comes. Pamela, although American, had built her career in Europe. In Europe, she was in Stuttgart, I think, most of the time. I really didn't know Pamela very well. I met her a few times toward the end of her time there. She wrote a wonderful manifesto of what opera was going to be under her leadership. It was visionary, it was exciting, she had several interesting ideas. But what she did was she canceled all the contracts of all the favorite singers. She brought in a whole new team to run the house, and she did a very different kind of opera. I don't know that I ever actually saw one of her productions myself, but what I do know is that the donor base went from 16,000 donors to 8,000 in her 5 years there, and that the company, fortunately, depends on, besides the hippies and the druggies, San Francisco produces several billionaires a day, and they kept the company going. And it's sort of restored all of that now that David Gockley's there. But it's very interesting on vision and big ideas versus knowing your audience. And I think this was the point Joe has made repeatedly this week, is it's all about building that relationship with your audience. And Pamela blew it. Yeah, and David said to bring it back.
But there is surely a duty on all of us for leadership. You can't just say, I know my audience, so I'm stuck in this hut that my audience has built for me. I mean, you've got to take the audience somewhere.
Absolutely.
That's,
I totally agree with David.
But other
That you have to bring them along slowly. Oh, I mean, if you don't have government funding, then the process is much longer. What happens in Europe, if you have government funding, you don't care if the audience, if your ticket revenues equal 20% of your total budget in the States, you're out of business. You're out of business. Yet that's what happens in Europe, 20%.
But if you look in the States, the best example I know of in the States these days where real innovation seems to take place, and it's not a company, but it's Brooklyn Academy of Music. They have an amazing following of people who come for all sorts of interesting, innovative, unusual offering, and the place is, as far as I can tell from what I've seen, always full. Is this correct? Am I?
Yeah.
And it's a very different experience, and maybe it has different audiences for different things. I've made pilgrimages there for different things over the years, but it is a place that has developed a following based on change, on challenges, on excitement.
Bill, I have a question for Dave, because I'm curious about this. So, at the WNO, I don't know how much funding you get from the government. What percentage of your total expense? Do you know offhand?
Well, we're roughly 70%.
70%. Okay. Now, if that goes to 35, let's say there's drastic cuts and it goes to 35, how do you deal with that? Well, in order to keep the company afloat, you're going to have to find ways for more earned and contributed revenue. And I think what you're saying you have to lead, you're going to then have develop a different kind of relationship with the audience because you're going to be relying on them. And I don't suggest that they tell you what to do, but I do suggest you need them to come to the theater so the company keeps afloat. You know,
And the
70%. Good Lord, I wish I had.
Yeah, but just a minute, Joe. You do have government funding. It's just differently distributed.
Absolutely, we don't have the middleman. We have it directly from the patron. And the difference is, does the government tell you, here's your 70%, however, I want to see X, Y, and Z?
Well, believe it or not, I mean, there is a very rigorous process of monitoring from the Arts Council about what we do. And, you know, we get documents like that, analyzing, you know, why isn't there enough ethnic diversity in your audience, for example? And, you know, those are one of the things that are going to be conditional on our funding.
How do you deal with that ethnic diversity? Because I was talking about that yesterday, where in New York City, believe it or not, well, 85% of the opera attendees are white, and the white population in the 5 boroughs is down to 33% because of the Hispanic and the Asian. So how do you deal with attracting? Because that's a question. How do you deal with the Hispanic community in the U.S. because it's a growing one? How do you deal with it? The ENO.
For WNO, it's extremely difficult and complicated because we're a touring company. So in Birmingham, there is a completely different ethnic diverse community to the ethnic diverse community in Bristol, or indeed in Cardiff. Cardiff has a very substantial Asian population, which is a completely different makeup from populations in other centres. But we do attempt to do outreach work in schools and communities and so on, and engage with those different communities, because that is, you know, we are a publicly funded body, so we have very important areas of social duty, actually, to perform, which I take very seriously.
So do you have any statistics as to the demographics of your audiences in these places?
We do, and on the whole, they're unsatisfactory, I would freely admit.
Could you send them to me? No, only because it's something that I'm very interested in, and nothing to do with this, but I'd be very, very pleased to be able to get a breakdown, because now that I'm really away from the Met and doing other things, this is of great interest to me, because it's a problem also that's going to be faced worldwide. If government funding, it's true, the U.S. government funds, they fund because I, the donor, say I want to give my money to the Metropolitan Opera, and the government loses the taxes on that money. So the government is funding it. The difference is we've eliminated the middleman. So unfortunately, the company has to deal with the donor. which in a sense you don't. You have to deal with the Ministry of Culture or whoever. It's a little different than dealing with a bunch of crazy, wealthy individuals.
Can I just ask you, Joe, in places like LA and Florida, where there is, say, a large Hispanic population with a lot of different sort of social backgrounds in terms of their income, and so you have a rich Hispanic population in Florida or in LA.
Well, let's talk about LA because I know something about it.
Fine. I mean, is the complexion of the audience in going to the LA Opera very different from New York?
No. Placido is the general director in LA, and what he did is produce Zarzuela, and he performed, and they couldn't sell it. He got an underwriter to underwrite. It was Univision, which is the biggest Spanish-speaking radio and television station in the world, and they underwrote it, and guess what? They still couldn't get them to come. Free, they couldn't get them to come.
Our experience in Miami was quite different. I was the deputy director of the Miami Opera for 6 years back in the 80s, and this was a period when the demographics of Miami had shifted dramatically from a very much a retiree, elderly, white, Northeast-oriented audience who'd retired there, 70 years ago. Most of my patrons were widows of old tycoons who dumped their wives, and these ladies who had been showgirls in their younger days, and rich new wives in their middle ages. In any case, we decided our audience was clearly changing, and we needed to do something about this. And we did two things. One, we marketed in Spanish. And our board was quite heavily populated by mostly Cubans, Cuban Americans, other Latins as we could find them. And that helped make a difference in terms of turning it into a socially useful tool for a lot of these people. The other thing we did was we marketed everything bilingually. Even though we were advised by our Hispanic leadership, we didn't need to print programs in Spanish and in English, but all of the marketing, all of the media was done bilingually. And my marketing director was a brilliant guy. He was fully fluent in English and Spanish, and he was very good on this kind of stuff. And we transformed our audience. In part, we had to get a new audience. We used to have our Tuesday night audience was our senior citizen audience. They were bussed in from the condominium complexes up in North Dade County, and on Sunday afternoon, their parents used to come. And it was a real challenge, but they eventually died, and so we had to fill those seats. And then we filled them with Latins.
I have a question for you. In Miami, what was the percentage of the Spanish-speaking, the Hispanic audience, what percentage were Cuban?
Majority, but I couldn't tell you exactly.
And what you'll find is that those Cubans, one, came out of Cuba with their money, and those Cubans wanted, for the same reason the Met was built back in the days of the Vanderbilts. They wanted a piece of Miami. They wanted to be part of the society. That's a completely different situation than L.A.
Oh, yes.
Because the L.A. Hispanic speak have no money. I mean, it's a different dynamic there.
I just want a short political spot here.
Okay.
Because just raising what you would be amazed to hear that we have this coalition government in this country, which started out by talking about the big society and saying, we want people to take up the slack that's not being provided by government and support charitable institutions of all kinds, including the arts. And guess what this bright government said in the last budget? Mr. Osborne got up and said, because for fairness reasons, I'm introducing a cap on the amount of money that you can deduct from the tax for charitable giving. And now it already is, I can point 2 or 3 letters already, like not 3 weeks after this guy made this ridiculous statement, saying, well, since hearing the Chancellor's statement, we're reconsidering all our donor arrangements because, because we're threatened with it being capped. Although none of them are actually giving money anything like up to the level of the cap. But he's provided everybody with a fantastic excuse.
But this is what happened in the Netherlands, where their cultural budget was cut, what did I say, 235 million, but they're taxing opera, and they're not taxing movies, sports, circuses, they're taxing opera and symphonic music. I mean, it's outrageous. Mm-hmm. And no, you're absolutely right. The country has to face up to that, and I don't understand why, with the political clout and the creativity, why in the UK you can't have a lobby and start pushing, throwing some weight around. Now, Ash, you're the one that needs to drive it. We're assigning you that job.
They're taxing opera because opera has this perception that Ivan was talking about, that you go to a performance of something rather experimental and different, and you have one audience which is a sort of a theatre audience that's used to sort of new and innovative things, and then you have this opera audience which is seen as the establishment audience that's got money, that's rich. Therefore, let's tax them. That's what they say. You know, because opera is seems to be quite smug and happy with its eliteness.
But that's not the case, though, because none of us are, obviously.
Let's bring the conversation a little bit back to opera and
We haven't
outreach.
got that message across necessarily.
Right.
And it's a hot, messy topic at the moment, the whole business. But let's talk about outreach and I think how you build audiences. And one of the things I wanted to get on the agenda today is media and how media is changing access to opera. When I was a kid growing up, the Met broadcasts was everything you listened to on Saturday afternoon. The Met broadcasts go back to what, about 1940, Joe? And the Met Tour predates that. That went on for a very long time. And these were ways in which people had access to things. If you didn't live in New York, you couldn't afford tickets at the Opera House. So what I've observed in the last 10 years, probably in many ways since you've even retired, the whole Met media thing has done some extraordinary things. Opera in the theaters. There's an audience of now, last time I read about this, about 100,000 people live in movie theaters worldwide, watching what 4,000 people can see sitting in the auditorium in New York. How is this going to transform our business, and how is it going to make a positive difference or a negative difference?
Well, I mean, the economics of this, you would know this better than I do. I mean, I think the Met is spending something like $1 million for every one of these cinema broadcasts, and they're making money out of it. But they're able to do that because they are wielding a utilizable mass market tool, which is expensive star singers, top conductors, I mean, a very glamorous profile. That sort of thing, for example, is just simply not available to Welsh National Opera. We can't command singers who have that sort of, clout that somebody in Singapore will buy a cinema ticket to go and hear them. And this is quite a dangerous situation. I mean, I know one always says this, everybody said when records came out, nobody'd go to the theatre anymore. It was not true. I mean, the hopeful thing is that this proliferation will generate more audience for the live art form. But you have to accept that there is anecdotal evidence that, for example, people in Hereford who used to drive for an hour and a half to go to the opera in WNO now find they can go around the corner and get Renee Fleming on the screen for half the money, and they don't have to drive home, and get stopped by the police and all that stuff.
Can I ask, I mean, there's an interesting thing about celebrity here, and the idea that now that, people can go to the cinema, that there's an expectation that celebrities have to drive what people are seeing because people want to know about famous names. And I just wondered from Ivan whether you feel that people who are coming into the profession as singers are feeling that, yeah, I've got to be famous in order to get anywhere, or do you think there's still a sort of a job to be done?
Yeah, I think singers have always felt like that. And singers have always wanted to be famous. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, most singers, that's why they get into it. And there's something that we carried out a strategic review, as Michael mentioned earlier, over the last year, and one of the two really key things that came out of it, and I'm sitting here I don't have the wealth of experience that several other people on this panel have, so I had reports that I can refer to there instead. And there were reports dating back to not that far, to the early 90s, that we looked through when doing this, that identified really clearly, it was something called the Ritterman Review, carried out by Dame Janet Ritterman, who I'm sure you'll know, that really clearly identified that the expectations that singers had when they were getting into singing, when they were leaving college, were far too high, because there is and always will be an oversupply of singers for the number of singing jobs that there are. And that there was therefore this it was referred to in different people we spoke to in different ways as either the gap or the ledge. That there was a gap between when they left college and when they considered themselves a professional singer. And that gap was huge and widening. And the fact that it was widening, I think, is particularly worrying. And part of the reason for that widening is because of what you say about celebrity. That actually, you had to get across the singers who were on the far side of the gap were a smaller number and further away than they used to be, because the big houses had to book the people who had the big names. So that gap was getting wider. The people who referred to it as a ledge, they generally referred to it as that because they saw it as something that actually they were just going to fall off. And that there isn't the kind of middle ground. It was harder these days to be a middle ground singer, someone who made their career from it. And some of that's about the fact that the house principal system doesn't exist anymore.
But if you go back to media, I mean, obviously the way the Met does an opera is a vastly costly thing, and it's cast with the very top names and all the glitz and glamour that goes with it. But the price of entry for a lot of technology-oriented things goes down, 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 down. So is there a space for a place like British Youth Opera, or even as glamorous a company as WNO, which may not be as glamorous as the Glorious Met, but you do some fantastic opera, both of you, and why can't you create a new audience, a more diverse audience, using media that are now available to us?
I think we should absolutely be doing that. I mean, there is a basic technical problem. And this will probably be solved quite quickly, I suspect. But at the moment, capturing the material in order to stream it is very expensive. I mean, if you're talking about a real opera production, you need 4 or 5 cameras minimum. You need the wagon and all the rest of it. And so you're talking £150,000 to record that evening in order to have it available to stream on the net or to put out in bite-sized chunks or however it is you want to do it. You've still got to capture it to start off with. And until we solve that expense, we're not going to find it easy to capitalize as we should be doing.
I think there's a question. Metropolitan Opera has always been known for it hires the stars. I mean, that's what the Met's about. It's the house of great singers. Covent Garden is similar. And so Covent Garden today they have opera and cinema. I think they're reaching about, if the Met reaches in 1 year 3 million, Covent Garden is up to 650,000 people between their opera and ballet. But they're still ballet or stars. So what's being sold, it's like it could be a bad movie, but with a great star, because people go to see the movie because, oh, wait a minute, such and such is in it. I think the question is what David is saying is that will this really be, will this opera and cinema be good for all companies? And it could very well not be, because they don't have the stars. Streaming, where if you can really get the cost down, very well maybe, because then everybody gets it. I mean, you don't even have to go out. But then a question comes up. How does that change the art form if everybody's watching it on their computer? I don't know, because that to me is another question.
Can I throw in a second expense, which is a very large one, and this requires a sort of cultural shift within our profession, which is the fees that all the artistes, including conductors, directors, designers, lighting designers, not to mention the singers and the musicians and then the publishers and the venues will want and do require you to pay in order to broadcast something, whether it's online or in any other form. Well, and at the moment that's still there and is not going away very quickly, and that's one of the reasons why the small companies aren't at the moment able to stream things.
No, but I think you've got to take a leaflet out of your friend Peter Gelb's book. I mean, Peter Gelb conducted the most ruthless negotiations at the Met, basically to wipe out the whole subject of rights. And I know this from personal experience. I actually negotiated the rights of my Hansel and Gretel translation with the Met Office, and I've never been in the grip of such ruthless negotiations. So basically, there's a whole expectation, which is a rather typical European problem, actually, that people have had quite a lot of money for quite a long time, out of media, and basically this market has collapsed totally. There is no money in recordings, there is no money in any of this thing, and everybody's got to wake up and realize that.
This is the conversation I had with David Gockley when he took over San Francisco, because first thing he did was he was looking for media outlets, and I'll come to a thing he's done, which I learned from Joe actually, but what he did was he wiped out the upfront cost by renegotiating the contracts with all the various parties such they were paid at the point of money being earned from it. And what he's done as an audience development tool, which I did not know until Joe told me this last night, was he's simulcasting live performances in the what is it, the Giant Stadium or something or other?
In the new Giant Stadium, the baseball stadium,
20,000 people.
Or whatever.
Free tickets. Come to the San Francisco Opera in the stadium. Free tickets. Buy all the popcorn, peanuts, candy you want. And maybe next week you'll think of coming to the real place and buy a real ticket. I haven't seen any statistics of how that's playing out for them.
Well, but in order to receive the free ticket, you have to email the opera. They then will offer you a reduced ticket price to come to the Opera House. And the last time I spoke to them, they've attracted, and I don't know what this means in terms of attendance, maybe you do, they've attracted 48,000 more new audience members. Now, I don't know what their total attendance is. You might know, Bill. But they are attracting people. But and the stadium, they have 25,000 people. Why? Because it's something more than opera. They can go to the Giant Stadium. They can walk around. It's an event, and there's no cost, and there's a community. Yes, so I mean, and so they're using it very well. I think. Now Dallas is doing it. And then Seattle is doing it this
But they took a leaf out of the Mets book, because in the 60s, if you wanted a program of the opera you've just heard on the Texaco broadcast, you'd call New York, and they'd get your name and your address and maybe your telephone number, and you were on the fundraising circular, and you were on the promotion circular if you happen to be through New York. So it's the idea is not exactly new. It's just the forum and the technology that supports it is.
Well, it's how it's delivered is what's new.
Well, how much do you think technology is raising audience expectations beyond what opera companies are actually going to be able to deliver? I mean, if somebody goes and sees the Ring at the Met and sees the kind of this great hydraulic system and Bryn Terfel doing this, and the most amazing production you've ever seen in your life that cost $40 million or whatever it was, and then they go to Welsh National Opera and see 2 bits of rope and a little hanky or whatever it is, representing the mountainside. They're going to think, well, actually, that's not what I go to the opera for.
This is the greatest opportunity for small companies. Don't be imitators. Don't put on Aida if you're in Kansas City. There are many things you can do to attract an audience, but don't imitate the big companies, because that's where they'll be disappointed. But give them new works, give them other works. I mean, and build your audience differently, and I think that's the key for them.
I mean, there was this whole discussion, wasn't there? Well, perhaps you and I are the only ones old enough to remember it, but...
oh, I know, I'm there. However the age is, I'm there.
There was this whole discussion that recordings were going to destroy people going to the theatre, and it never did. I mean, in fact, it raised interest. Right. It raised the profile.
It was recordings, and then it was television, and it was everything.
And the
was
movie
going to kill
business
the opera.
I think people are fascinated by live events. It's even a small production of a small company. I mean, I happened to be in Oxford, I don't know, a year ago. I saw an amazing little opera about Alzheimer's. I mean, a brilliant piece about a really interesting subject, unusual subject for an opera, and it's a live experience, and I'm absolutely convinced that people want live, authentic experiences.
Right. See, I think the future is this. Let's assume that the Met, Covent Garden are very, very successful with opera and cinema. And then people all of a sudden like that. Now, smaller companies, once technology, and if they can find a way to afford it, they put opera and cinema. You're building a different audience. Just like you have to build an audience in the theater, you're building an audience. And I think there's some possibility of that, if you can control costs. And it's then a question, and I don't know what the union situation is here, but what do you have to pay for the rights? And that's what it boils down to. But it seems to me that there is sometime out in the future the opportunity for all opera in cinema. Now, whether that does to the live in the auditorium, I don't know. But there's going to be an opportunity for it. It's a question of whether it's good or bad. I don't know.
I think it's interesting that people try to recreate the live experience when they go to the cinema. And the few times that I've been, people will applaud after high notes, or they'll dress up a bit to go to,
Right.
to see the operas, and they dress differently. And I think there is a sense of knowing that actually, you know, there is a difference. There's sort of a difference. They want to create a sense of, I'm going to do something a bit special, and it's the opera.
Well, I think then for you, David, jump on it and find a way to get some of these productions in the theater. Because if the Met and Covent Garden are selling well, then they'll want more product, won't they? And then if you have the product, and you start out small, I mean, there's not a big money. I mean, Met is making money because of the number of people they're reaching. However, it's really a 50-50 split. Whatever comes into the movie theater, the Met gets half, and the theater gets half. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there's a way of doing that. And new technology might make it less expensive.
Well, I'd love to see if there's any data that's been collected as to what the audiences of these new media audiences are. Are they just the people who don't want to spend double the price and risk driving home having had too many glasses of wine? Or are they in fact people who just could never imagine going to the Met or the Royal Opera House, or even to the ENO's wonderful new place, but for 25 quid or whatever it is in the regional theaters in the States, you know, it's an interesting night out to try something they never tried before.
I mean, the problem is that the theatres that are putting this on are not connected to our circuit. They're cinemas. So they won't release that data to us because we've, I mean, the group of national company directors have met and that was an issue on the agenda, and we've been seeking to get this information because it would be very interesting.
Is it known in the States? Do you have the data in the States?
Here, the situation in the States is 2% of the population goes to the opera. 5% will listen to music, whether it be Sirius radio, DVDs, and what David Gockley did is he showed everyone that if it's free, he gets 25,000 people. Okay, so they're there. The question is, it's a matter of price. And that's what you have to balance. Because I do believe that of the 5% of the population in the States, which is today, 15 million, but only 2% go, I think they want to go. One, they can't afford it. Two, it doesn't work for them, travel, transportation. But I think there's a way of getting them. So I think you can build the audience that way. It's a question of, can the companies afford to do it, and can you make deals with the movie houses? And that's the other problem.
I think at this point, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas, a lot of excitement in the world of opera, whether it's walking around in a circle while they're performing or going to the local movie cinema. Why don't we open the floor to questions from those of you who've been listening to us now for the last hour and a quarter? And would anybody like to pose some challenging, interesting questions? I can't see very well. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm very astonished that none of the composers present didn't storm down to the platform and say, I can create a mountainside for you. Didn't you think of it twice? A working program.
Well, actually, in response to that, Robert Saxton, I wrote a piece of radio opera for the BBC, The Wandering Jew, over the last 20 years. And the great joy of it was that I didn't have to deal with an opera house or director or anything. the audience and the listener on the radio can fill everything in, the pictures and everything. And although it cost the BBC a lot of money, it was a lot cheaper than a production. And I'm not seriously trying to slag off opera houses, but there are an enormous amount of assumptions been made in this discussion, I'm sorry to be critical, which any of my composer colleagues or writer colleagues, or serious writers, would have picked up immediately about, the word innovation is a very dangerous one. I've never heard a composer discuss it when we're all sitting around having dinner. It's not a word that composers or writers, in my experience, discuss. And also,
why not?
A lot of because it doesn't mean anything. And the other thing is that because people like Wagner were trying to, let's not go there.
Stay away from that one.
The other thing, if I may say, is a lot of what you're trying to do with British youth opera is hugely admirable. But in fact, again, these are not new discussions. Stravinsky did The Soldier's Tale of Renard in the First World War. Carmen, by the way, is 1870s, not 1830s, so it's a slightly different audience from the 1830s. The other thing is Britain was involved in all this with the English Opera Group, the real invention of the church parables, which was not invented by the Arts Council or a committee of an opera house, so it was actually done by a great creative artist with imagination. So I'm sorry to sound a bit critical, but I do, in response to Professor Trout's point, think that the discussion could have gone in, needs to be had, taking into account a lot of different, there's Aaron Copland's wonderful school operas like The Second Hurricane, and I mean, surely this discussion needs to be a very much deeper historically and wider. Sorry.
Yeah, I think if we have another 24 hours and you're prepared to stay here, we can really get into that. However, but we appreciate your comments, and I'm sorry, I'm not the moderator. And why is your wife kicking you, by the way? Any particular reason? She always does that. Okay.
Right.
Can I just say that that was one of the points I was trying to make quite early on. I think was actually about this music theatre opera distinction or not, and bringing up Camilla Tonen was sort of part of that. And I used the phrase grand opera, and I think that's what, in a sense, the big opera houses, that's what they talk about because that's what they do. Whereas, as you say, exactly, I mean, British Youth Opera last year, we did the Rape of Lucretia, it's one of Britain's chamber operas, and yet we can do those smaller pieces, and the smaller companies can. And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, I'm on OMTF, the Opera Music Theatre Forum, and I think what we see there is that the direction that the small-scale companies are taking is a different one, and it is actually divergent from the ones that the opera houses are taking. And I think that does have the implications for, quote, the art form, unquote, is that it's not one art form. They are different, and they're going in different directions.
Just to add, as we are in Oxford, my colleague Dr. Harry, who's unfortunately not able to be here today, in the music faculty, is not only written a children's opera, which is toured Britain, but he's actually set up a project with our music faculty where our students are working with Castleton and doing outreach work with people who are educationally challenged and all sorts of things.
If you're going to make a speech, could you use a microphone? It's very difficult to hear you.
Well, he's just finishing right now, so thank you. Bill, let's ask for other questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, good idea. Okay, another question out here, sorry. Up in the back there. Speak loudly.
I think it's an interesting issue, especially trying to get a new audience into opera. Having been to many more traditional operas at the big opera houses, and also to like ones in a warehouse in Hackney and really small scale ones, I think trying to get a new audience, especially a younger audience, is something that both of those very divergent kinds of opera are trying to get people into. And I wonder what you thought, A, about kind of social media and kind of this new trend of getting young people on board, and B, whether the big opera houses are actually doing enough. Where they, there was Julia Frere's Misfortune at the Royal Opera House recently, billed it as being like kind of cutting edge. There were break dancers. They made a really big point of that. Yet the break dancers were glorified scene shifters and really weren't part of the production at all. And the existing audience, kind of vaguely enjoyed it. The new audience actually were potentially a little bit disappointed. So I wondered whether A, you think that social media and things like that will help both types of opera, and whether you think that the big opera houses are actually doing enough to get a new audience.
The question is about social media. I would personally say I think you have to break it up into different kinds of institutions, different kinds of organizations, or even citizen opera as advocated over here. And I think what are the big companies doing with social media?
A lot, I think. Certainly WNO has a very active Twitter and Facebook campaign, which is monitored daily, and which people spend quite a lot of time dealing with. W, like all the main opera companies, actually has, since the 1980s, also very, very active and, I would say, Europe-leading education and outreach programs. I mean, many countries in Europe have looked to come to Britain to study what the Baylis program did at ENO, what the Max WNO group are doing, because we are actually, as a country, very much at the top of the game in that area. So I think a lot is happening to make outreach happen.
But I do agree with you when you say that, you know, there has to be, you have to, if you're going to use social networking, if you're going to say, right, opera's really trendy, come and see what we're doing, you have to deliver. And that's, I think that is the problem with big institutions, is that, you know, they're sort of using these sort of networks that people talk to each other on in a, sometimes it's a slightly patronizing way, sometimes it's a group of old farts like us, you know, trying to be trendy and talk to people. And actually, when you go to the opera house, you're seeing opera. You know, you're not going to a pop concert. You're not going to something sort of, you know, you're not going to a breakdancing event. It is opera, and that's what I think you have to manage expectations through social networking, and not say we're doing something really that you're not going to, you know, something that's going to disappoint you.
Yeah, how about a small company?
We, in a sense, we're taking the lead at the moment from the larger companies. I was going to say that the opera houses, while they do use all the social media, they use it in a very marketing department kind of way. They use it for publicity and marketing rather than for actual sort of interaction with the audience. I think what's going to be almost the make or break on social media and the way it's used in the opera houses is tweet seats. If you've come across those, some theatres are now doing them, which is that there are specific seats set aside for people who want to blog about what they are seeing as they are seeing it. So they are sitting there with their handheld devices.
Ivan, what do you base that opinion on when you were...
The marketing department bit.
Excuse me?
Sorry, the marketing department bit.
Your marketing department?
No, sorry.
No, you said, if I understand correctly what you were saying, is that the larger companies are using it for marketing and ticket sales.
Marketing and publicity.
Publicity, rather than dialogue and a community. And I totally disagree with you, because it's all about dialogue and a community. I don't think there are any studies as to the result of Facebook or Twitter as to sales, but there are results about how many people are on Facebook. All you got to do is look on Facebook. It tells you how many fans you have. And Twitter, I mean, and I know the Met has the largest Facebook following of any company in the world. And I don't know that they measured, but I don't think there are big ticket sales from that. I think it's education. I think it's dialogue, community, and education, and I think it has to build.
I would agree with the education part, that yes, it has the value there.
Because it's not a marketing tool, in my opinion. It's really, it's
I
reaching community.
But I think a lot of institutions are using it as a marketing tool.
They're trying to.
And I think that actually, you know, when it's used well, it's actually a community of people talking to each other.
I mean, that's exactly what it is, and that's what that any company and every company should have it. But the head of that company should instruct their people as to what the purpose of it is, and have very clear guidelines of how you work with Facebook and Twitter. I mean, I think it's very important.
I mean, the most successful things that we've done is to say, like, even during a performance, a singer on a particular evening will tweet when they're off the stage and say, I'm putting a clean pair of pants on because somebody's just chucked a bucket of blood over me. But that's part of the opera, you know. And this kind of, because it's authentic and personal, this goes down very well indeed.
Well, you know, Stephanie Bly, she does it all the time. I mean, anybody can tweet Stephanie Bly. She loves it. Now, I don't know if she's going to answer when she's about to make her entrance, but you never can tell with her. She might just.
Any more questions? Back there. I'm not sure we understand the question.
I think you're referring to Carmen Jones. Yeah, I mean, it was actually a very clever adaptation of Carmen into a southern black context. That's right, isn't it?
I did want to finish what the composer took over.
Well, do you fellas want to have a conversation outside? Because we don't have that much time. And yes, if there's a question for this panel, excuse me, if there's a question for this panel, fine. But I mean, I just want to try to keep moving along if we can.
What the composer tries to create is not one mountainside, but if the theatre holds 5,000 people, 5,000 mountainsides. Its individual experience has to focus on the musical language.
Well, I think opera does still have to have that theatrical dimension. I mean, what I'm slightly surprised by what Robert said was that composers don't talk to directors. That if you're composing a new work, surely you're working with a director to.
I didn't say that.
Well, do you work?
Bill, I don't want to have this conversation.
Yeah, we'll slow it down here. Okay, any more questions out there? Well, I think at this point it's my job to thank Michael Burden for getting us all together, to thank Joe for a fabulous 3 days here, and my fellow panelists here, David, Ash, and sorry, Ivan, forgive me. And thank you all for coming. I think it's been a great conversation. I'm sure we can linger a bit, and if anybody wants to ask one-on-ones to anybody, please do. Thank you all very much.